Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. That's for me. Wherever you are on this planet, this fast forward planet, still sadly wrapped in a pandemic. The data from India right now, particularly, are just as distressing as you can imagine. And there was some posting on Twitter this morning of some findings that flights from New Delhi to Toronto have had at least one person carrying the virus. And that means if we're not doing very careful contact tracing, we could have some new outbreaks. About 6 billion out of the 7.8 billion of us on the planet have not seen a single shot yet. It's kind of easy for those who have to feel sort of relaxed, but this is going to go on for a long time. 1 year ago is when I was already in high gear with this webcast, Sustain What, examining pathways to resilience and better outcomes in the future. And I'm happy here on Earth Week, Earth Day, Earth Century, to have two really great guests to talk about grappling not just with risk as we understand it, but understanding how we react to risk. Each of us is unique. Even among the three of us, there'll be differences of opinion on something as simple as climate change. We'll get into that in a minute. I'm Andy Revkin again, and this is the Earth Institute Sustain What webcast. I'm going to start with a little piece of artwork, and then we'll get to Michele Wucker, whose new book is "You Are What You Risk: The New Art and Science of Navigating an Uncertain World," and Kimberly Nicholas, professor of sustainability science at Lund University in Sweden, who has grappled with the momentousness of human-driven climate change and emerged activated rather than paralyzed. I can't wait to learn more about her path. The book charts this out beautifully, and she's also developed a curriculum with others around these issues. Her book is Under the Sky We Make: How to Be Human in a Warming World. So, but I'm starting here with a little piece of artwork that a neighbor of mine, John Allen, who's a conceptual artist here in the Hudson River Valley in Lenape territory, created. And this is a little bit a video from an exhibition that opened here in a tiny little gallery in the village of Cold Spring, 2011. And it says a lot about our current situation.
How are you?
Just ran up here, so it's
Very quick and simple, but you get the idea. And John told me, I did a piece on my blog about him and this back at the Times. He said he had set it up in his kitchen to see if he got bored by it, if it sort of faded into the background. And indeed, it kind of did. It's just such a disturbing piece. It talks the way I've written about this since 2008, when a .earth reader posted the comment, "Are we stuck with blah, 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 bang?" And that's why I can't wait to chat with you both. If you can unmute now, we'll get into the show. And it's great to have you both here. Kim, are you in Sweden?
Yes, I am. I'm in southern Sweden.
So where is the university?
Well, Sweden is kind of shaped like California, and Lund is basically where San Diego would be. So it's in the bottom left corner.
Great. And Michele Wucker, you are, as you were telling me a minute ago, you're in Chicago these days after a long stay in New York.
Yeah, all the people get the East Coast and the Eastern Time and Central Time confused all the time. I moved to Chicago in 2014. My great-grandparents met here at the beginning of the last century before moving to Milwaukee. So looking forward to visiting my friends in New York again when that's a thing.
Yes. I have not been on a plane, and I'm sure it's true for almost everybody in more than a year. And things are changing slowly, but they are changing. So let's get into these two visions of where we're at, how we got here, what our perceptions are, and where we go from here. You both, I'd love to start with each of you just giving a quick sense of how you became you, just sort of the thumbnail sketch. What's interesting to me is most people I've met in 30 years working on sustainability questions don't have a straight line path in their career. Some do. Some people just come out of the womb wanting to be a journalist. At the Times, I was surrounded by people who just grew up wanting to do that thing. It was not me. And I imagine for Michele and Kim both, there was some juncture. So if you just sort of give a little quick snapshot of how you got focused on the questions that now drive you forward and got to the core of this book. Maybe Michele first.
Sure. Well, it actually involved a lot of surprises. I started out actually wanting to be a psychiatrist, but was really much more interested in the psychology side of things, and realized that med school was not a great risk decision because I pass out when I see blood. So that there was a brief detour into med school fantasies, but it's actually worked out well because there's a lot of psychology in what I do now. So I've sort of come full circle. I always knew I wanted to write books and to travel. So I started out as a financial journalist, spending a lot of time in Latin America, doing a lot of writing about debt restructuring from the 1980s, all of the defaulted loans. And from there went into the think tank world, first working out of the World Policy Institute and then running it for 7 years, and increasingly writing books, and was surprised. They teach you when you're a young journalist, you're just telling the story. You're not, telling people what to think. And I found myself more and more saying, well, this is what I think that people should think. I try to help them draw their conclusions for themselves. But when I came up with the gray rhino idea in 2012, this idea that we're way too likely to take our eyes off of the big obvious thing coming at us, that seemed to me to be so big and so rich for exploring that I left the think tank world and have been focusing completely on risk, on how we deal with obvious risks, and then finally came full circle, as I mentioned, to the psychological angle of it, that, what goes into each of our own decisions about risk, our innate personality, the habits, the people around us, the circumstances that shape those decisions, and took another surprising turn in that my work has always been in policy and finance and business and strategy. And my readers really wanted more on the personal side. So have taken a very surprising personal turn in my new work that actually took me back to my very first career aspiration. Not actually the very first. The very first was to be an ice skating cheerleader, but that's not really, that wasn't going to happen.
An ice skating cheerleader? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I had a big imagination when I was a kid.
I mean, that's your backup plan, right? There's always a future chapter for that, maybe.
I'm writing that down. So, and thank you. And Kim, I think we intersected briefly, maybe, or somehow through Steve Schneider, but like, how did you get from that dive into science into this dive into the larger picture of humanness and science?
Well, I think I have a drawing from when I was about 5 where I said I wanted to be either an astronaut or a scientist. And I'm holding a vial and saying vitamin Z. So that was something I thought had not yet been discovered. I don't know if that's even a thing, but that was how I imagined discovering. So I think I always loved the idea of engaging curiosity and learning and finding out new things. So that appealed to me about science. That was connected with my love of nature, growing up in Sonoma, north of San Francisco, on a dirt road at the time, and not having neighbors and spending lots of time outdoors. And then later in the Sierra and the Pacific Ocean coastal landscape. So at university, when I was at Stanford, and as you mentioned, Steve Schneider was my undergrad advisor, but I had a chance to start getting involved as a research assistant and working on research projects, and found them really fun and engaging, and not at all how I had imagined, which I thought would be very sort of stiff and plodding and methodical. And in the field, you are really problem solving and being creative and working in a team. And I really enjoyed that. So for a long time, I was going between the worlds of science and policy. I worked at an NGO for a few years before going back to grad school. And I think increasingly my work has been more and more focused on the human aspects, because it was clear from even in the 90s when I was doing field work and as an undergrad, humans were really running the planet, and we were having this huge impact on the planet. And it didn't really make sense to study the idea of nature in isolation from humans, because that's just not a thing. So, and increasingly now as a sustainability scientist, I think I see my role as helping deliver what society has said through democratic processes we want, which is a stable climate, a world where everybody has an opportunity for a good life, thriving nature. And we're obviously not doing that right now, and not on track to do that. So yeah, I feel increasingly the outreach and communication through writing and speaking and making new contacts and having conversations like this feel really important.
And Steve Steve Schneider, who was at Stanford at that time. The first book I read of his, it was co-written with a science writer, was The Co-Evolution of Climate and Life, and it was implicitly about a relationship between nature and people and the system, as opposed to biogeophysical. And then much more so later, as I got to know his work even more, he became much more focused on the social climate, essentially. And I assume, I'm not blaming you on him, but you know what I mean? You definitely got it feels like you got pulled into that reality too. This is a two-way relationship between us and the system and between us and each other. And you can't just sort of lay out the numbers and expect, and this gets to Michele's work, you can't just sort of lay out the numbers and expect everyone to go, okay, I'm going to just stop driving tomorrow and we'll turn off every power plant. It's harder than that. So that's why I thought it was fun to bring you two together, because it's kind of divergent but synchronous views of the world. I wanted to go a little deeper on your work, Kim. I'm just going to share a screen again, because there's a concept that seems at the core of your book, and you could let me know if you agree or disagree, but it's that you mentioned this shift from an exploitation mindset to a restoration mindset, if I have it right. And I'm just showing you there images from where I live. This is 2 miles from my house. It's a quarry that was active, extracting the granite that and other rock, bluestone that much of Manhattan is built of, put on ferries and barges and going down to the river. And that picture was taken in like the 1960s. And then the picture to the right is the same landscape now from Google Earth. Anyone can go to Google Earth and put in Little Stony Point. And you see something's happening there. And now it's a state park. And what had been a loading dock is gone. So tell me about this exploitation to restoration concept.
Sure. So in my book, it's about how we can face the climate crisis with facts, feelings, and action. And I wanted to provide really concrete evidence and specific tips that people can put into practice in their own lives. But more than that, I wanted to give a set of principles and ways of thinking about things that then people can make use of, whatever your circumstance, because we need this kind of innovation and creativity and people adapting what is necessary from a climate point of view to all of our own lives. So the way I frame this is in talking about the exploitation mindset, which is focused on extraction and consumption and is exploiting nature and other people, and that is bad. And I'm advocating instead for, I call it the regeneration mindset. So focusing on centering the well-being of people and nature, reducing harm at its source instead of treating its symptoms, and increasing resilience to deal with tough times. So I think applying those principles, which I try to illustrate through examples throughout the book, that's the basic argument that I'm making, that is what we need to live well within the biophysical bounds of the planet Earth, which is finite. And we're right now overusing resources and polluting our atmosphere and land. And in order to stop doing that and have a good life for everyone, those principles can help serve as a compass to point us in that direction.
And you also, there's a really cool section in the book. We could talk more about food in a minute, but drawing on I found this, by the way. This is so cool.
Oh, yeah.
Google is your friend.
That's my grandmother.
On turkeys and your strong feelings about industrial agriculture. And this was, I have the link to it. I can, it's in this PowerPoint, which I can share online later. But yeah, this is, I think, your brother too. Your brother Bob, or he.
That's my dad. So Grandpa George is second from right. So let's see, 1960s. No, my dad's not there because he would have been.
It says
no,
George.
I don't think. Yeah, George is my grandfather. So that's my father's father.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just to tell folks a little bit about this idea of how we feed ourselves and how that relates to your vision of where we go from here.
Yeah, so my family history is actually in industrial animal agriculture. My grandpa George here helped invent the system of factory farming by creating this turkey breed, which is the Nicholas broad-breasted white. So that's the main turkey. If you eat a butterball or whatever turkey for Thanksgiving, you're eating Grandpa George's turkey. Wow. And they were bred for quickly growing on efficient resources, or minimizing inputs and maximizing outputs, which is basically the theory behind agriculture today. But that means taking resources and turning them into waste. So basically food that people could eat, grains, are turned into animal food, and cranking out animals through this kind of industrial system. So they're actually, the breast of the turkey is so large that the birds can't reproduce naturally. The bodies of the birds actually don't physically fit together. So it's somebody's job to be an artificial inseminator of turkeys to produce the turkeys that are sold in supermarkets. And I tell this story because to me, it illustrates a lot of the thinking that I think we need to get beyond in shifting from exploitation of nature to working within and the bounds of nature, and working with rather than against nature. So if we're going to have animal agriculture, figuring out how to make animals part of a closed loop on a farm, recycling wastes and living on leftovers rather than eating food that people could eat. And that kind of agriculture will look very different than what we have today, but be one that we can actually sustain, and that will not be contributing a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions and the majority of the biodiversity crisis, which is what legacy of agriculture is today.
And this gets to this reality, I guess, that's illuminated in Michele's book a little bit, and you talk about this too. The understanding that there are sort of competing risk landscapes right now. That someone in a poor country is going to be more focused on just getting food, period, than on ethical or macro long-term impacts. And someone who's not conscious of the backstory of agriculture has no guidance, no way to even start the question. And that gets to Michele's work. A new part of your book, one part of your book, is about getting cognizant of the risks around us. And this was the Gray Rhino, your first book too, was understanding things a little bit better. You can't really act before you have some sense of where you are. So one of the key concepts I take from your book is this shift from, well, first it would be risk agnosticism, like risk ignorance, I guess, basically, when we just literally aren't thinking about the landscape around us, to risk aversion, where some of us, and not all, draw back from signals. But you're talking about risk immersion, I would call it, sort of diving in, feeling the shapes of the risk around us. Some are like a gray rhino. They're big and giant. I'm going to die, right? So I don't think about it every day, but I'll tell you, when I had a stroke 10 years ago, this July, suddenly I was starting to think about factors that relate to stroke. It was a really lucky stroke. But so we live in this landscape of inevitable loss and risk and damage, but we don't grok it. So could you talk a little bit about what's the building blocks you start with, both in Gray Rhino and in the new book? How does the person sort of start to integrate some of that?
Well, it's interesting. It went sort of from the 30,000 foot to the very personal. The Gray Rhino started out as a metaphor for talking about why some people see the big, obvious, scary thing coming at them. The 2 tons with a horn, pawing the ground and snorting and getting ready to come your way. And some people see it and do something about it, and some people don't. And I was specifically starting with some work that came out of the difference between the Argentinian and the Greek debt crises, where Argentina had a chance to avoid a chaotic collapse and default and missed it, and Greece came to an agreement with its creditors. It was still tough, but around the time I started writing the book, I really wanted to know why. And came up with the Gray Rhino because, as you were saying before, you can't just come up with numbers and throw them at people to get them to understand something. You need an emotional connection. So in a lot of the addresses that I do, I'll show a video of a rhino coming at people. And it's really great when you're a room full of hundreds of people and they go, that collective gasp. Right. And that's what I want. And get them to focus on, okay, what's the big scary thing coming at you? And I, of course, started writing about, climate change was one of the very big ones, but also my work in finance, but also typical, corporate strategy decisions like, changing market conditions and new inventions and all sorts of things like that. I wanted something that was very broadly applicable and emotional. So that's really where the gray rhino came from. And when the book came out, at every single one of my events, this was starting in 2016, someone said, how do I apply this to my personal life? Right. And I was in China in 2017, shortly after the book came out. It became a very big bestseller in China. And this young man comes up to me in Shanghai and wanted a selfie and an autograph and said, you helped me so much with my life. When, I said, are you talking to someone behind me? Because I don't really, do that. And so I ended up delving into much more depth into the personal aspects of why people deal with the big scary thing coming at them or don't. And of course, climate change comes in again to You Are What You Risk, the sequel, in, why do some people pay more attention to climate change and why don't they? And more importantly, how do we create the conditions that encourage people to pay attention and do something about it?
And how does, Kim, how does that relate to your thinking? This book is very personal for you too. You've done the risky thing for scientists is to talk about the personhood part of science. Had so many discussions over the years with climate scientists, some public, some private, about getting into the public sphere, and some people just barrel ahead like a rhino. Michael Mann is sort of the rhino version of a climate communicator, and then others are more circumspect and careful. Ken Caldera comes to mind as someone who's always he taught me, this climate and energy scientist Ken Caldera taught me about Hume from the 1700s, the guy who said you can't get an ought from an is. Is science, is data. The ought, what do you do, is values. So you have to get there. You're a human being, right? So do you have your own sense of what drove you to take that further step?
Well, now I'm thinking, what is my communication spirit animal? If Michael Mann is the rhino, I'll have to think about that one. But, is Ken a giraffe? Or, he's an excellent communicator as well. I do think, I remember you, Andy, we were at a conference together in 2015. I'm not sure we actually spoke, but I heard you speaking, talking about The Guardian had just made the Keep It in the Ground campaign for fossil fuels. Right. And there was this discussion of, is this appropriate for a media outlet to take what can be considered a political stand? And, their argument was, there's really overwhelming evidence that this is actually the path we need to take to stabilize the climate. And we are on the side of doing that. So, we're communicating this message. And I remember you said something that stuck with me, which was, I think, helpful for scientists, which was suggesting that you could say, I'm a climate scientist, I study ice cores or whatever it is that you do. I'm a citizen. I worry about this because that, I care about these things and they are affected by, my work shows what's happening, and as well as thousands of other colleagues, this is the direction things are pointing. I guess, yes, it is a little bit uncomfortable territory for me to write and talk about, these personal experiences of grief and loss and anger and the emotional side of climate change, but it just has become unavoidable. It's 2021. We are in a climate emergency. Perfect. We didn't even coordinate, but there, that point is very well made.
Oh, I just searched for it. It wasn't something pre-planned.
Okay. Yeah. No, nice.
Yeah.
But it's no longer theoretical to do my work. My family was evacuated in the wildfires in California in 2017, and thankfully they were safe. But we have many friends and family who lost their homes, and we know those fires are made more devastating and more likely and bigger because of human-caused climate change. So I do have personal experiences about it, or students, crying in my office because the systems that they study and are trying to work to protect are slated to be devastated and basically wiped out by climate change if we don't make the necessary changes. So I think there is an emotional side to it. And then, as I kind of alluded to earlier, I think I am a sustainability scientist, and that is a normative endeavor. because it was founded kind of explicitly to be so. It sees itself, we see ourselves as sustainability scientists as delivering on normative promises and saying, okay, we're not just describing problems, we're also trying to be solutions oriented and explicitly talking about values. And scientists should not be the ones who are setting values for society. Those need to be debated democratically. But in cases like with the Paris Agreement and the UN sustainability goals, they have been, the discussion has been had. We've made these decisions in a democratic way that this is the world we want to live in, one with a stable climate that's well below 2 and aiming for no more than 1.5 degrees of warming. And we're very far from where we need to be to make that happen. So I think pointing that out and highlighting what needs to happen and what needs to change in order to get there is the role of a scientist like myself.
So Michele, you operate at the interface of expertise and like big companies and institutions. You advise folks on these questions, but you also there face a very variegated landscape of interests and beliefs and values. So when you think of the 196 countries, of course, who hewed onto the Paris Agreement, the part of the Framework Convention, same thing there. Everyone looks at the same language and finds their wiggle room or their way to sort of grasp, to sign something, but also keep being who they are. The nationally determined contributions part is really important in the Paris Agreement, giving every country the flexibility to do its own thing. So Michele, in the context of climate, or just advice to big institutions that grew up in the 20th century, in the extractive century, how do you broach these kinds of issues?
Well, self-interest is a good starting point. I think, helping people to, because people are selfish, helping them see what's in it for them. And that can come in very, very different ways for different companies. In some ways it's an, efficiency and supply chain stability argument. In some cases it's an HR, like recruiting people argument. Particularly you hear about millennials and Gen Z wanting companies that, that at least try to not seem evil. It also has to do with, companies and constituencies, who your customers are. I mean, there has been increasing demand for sustainable products, which also has, brought with it greenwashing and things like that. So, it involves really some literacy around, what's for real and what's not. And to be honest, even as someone who tries to stay pretty informed, there's sometimes when I don't even know if something is, is what it claims to be. But in the finance world in particular, and any company that's got money invested, they've got their reserves funds invested someplace, any company that's got money invested in anything should really be thinking about the impact of those investments on the rest of their business. And in finance, the last couple of years, that conversation has become very, very open. It's like, if you're investing in fossil fuels, then you don't really want to be invested in, say, municipal bonds, because a huge part of the world's urban population lives in coastal areas and other places that are vulnerable to rising sea levels and other parts of climate change. You don't really want to be invested in, coastal real estate, which is also extremely vulnerable. You're also worried about supply chain shocks from extreme weather. You're worried about the price of food, also weather impacts. And so once you start looking at this as a system, you start seeing a lot more self-interest. And so far there's been a lot more talk, not as much movement as needs to be, although we have seen, something of a decrease in investment in fossil fuels over the past year, in particular as people thought about the relationship between, climate change and viruses and all of these environmental factors. And we've seen a lot more money going into ESG, environmental, social, and government funds, places that are actually thinking about their impact and how well they are governed and the externalities that are out there. And I think too that as people are more vocal about some of these things, governments are paying attention. Some governments more than others, but that starts to apply to the government relations part of a company. And what are the things that what are the areas where they can be constructive, and where are the areas where, hopefully they're not going to be obstructionist to change, although, we know that in many cases that's what companies do. So it's a very different set of conversations, and it really depends on the crowd. When I talk to people who are in ESG, they're actually really thinking about systemic risks and transparency and risk disclosure, the risk to their companies from climate change. And people who are outside of that think ESG is something else. I don't want to repeat their misimpressions of it, but there's a couple conversations I've had in different groups over the last couple of weeks where it left my head spinning, that people who don't really understand the ESG principles and arguments really completely get it wrong. Like, somebody sent me a cartoon with E is I forget what it was, but exploitation, suppression, slavery, and sort of bad things. Right. And and I just thought, well, this could have been paid for by the companies that don't want ESG, only they're trying to get critics on the other side of it, because I've seen the risk cost benefit analysis of it. I know a lot of people involved with these conversations, and I mean, yes, I've drunk the Kool-Aid, but I also think, actually, don't drink Kool-Aid, it's not good for you, but I don't really like it anyway. But you get the picture.
You're both. This gets to an important point, I think, which is a big chunk of what you were thinking and doing is related to education, whether it's in a classroom or, in the case of Michele, more just public education of leadership. And I want to just show there's a curriculum that's been developed around your really. This is how much of this is drawn from the book, Kim, and how much of this is a wider view of the questions. But maybe you could summarize a little bit what you're hoping to accomplish. Like, who needs teaching, and other than in your classrooms, and what would be the goal? And then we'll get to some of what Michele's working on in this book, the new book.
Sure. So this is a way of looking at climate literacy, and it's based on more than a decade now of about 15, 16 years now of research showing what people need to know about climate change. And that can be summarized as: it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it. And I have another slide that shows how these are basically derived from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So that's the leading authority that summarizes the state of climate science. And these, maybe Andy's going to show this now, but we, with a team of master students, we took the latest report, which is now more than 5 years old, from the IPCC, and use qualitative content analysis to break it down into pieces. And that's where that rainbow wheel comes from. So basically we said, okay, what research shows you need to know to be climate literate is these 5 things. This is also, derived from the IPCC. We kind of took as a litmus test: you should be able to read and understand the synthesis report of the IPCC to be climate literate, because this represents the state of science that is supposed to support decision-making by governments, for example, in order to meet the Paris Agreement, among other things. So that's where that comes from. And then we basically looked at the wheels of the globe are going outward, or the wedges of the globe, I mean to say, are going outward and saying, here's what those components look like, and here's what a teaching curriculum could look like at the university level to show that. And when we looked at what's being taught today, unfortunately, very little of this in the study. Right. In Canada, at least, there was very little. There was focus on the fact that warming is happening, but not on the scientific consensus around that. And research shows that it's really important that people know that, so that they basically support ambitious climate policy and also support the kinds of changes that will make a difference. And there was very little focus on solutions. So at the moment, we are not doing a good job in higher education or in high schools of educating climate citizens who are getting the information they need to be literate in one of the most important, if not the most important, topics that is already affecting them and will affect their lives, and they need in order to be informed citizens.
That's such a tough issue there, because teachers are so stuck now because the landscape around this problem has gotten so polarized. I was on an NPR conversation on aspects of this, and a teacher called in one of the call-ins. I should play it here. I don't have time to cue it up. And she said she's petrified. She's more stressed by teaching climate than she is by climate change, and it was so unfortunate because I mean one way I've been talking about it lately is just when you break it down into, when you start with climate risk, meaning what is the climate we want, what's the relationship we want with the climate, and how do you get there in any particular community, you can come up with a whole laundry list without even talking about climate change. So it's sort of I wouldn't say a competing theory of efficacy would be starting with climate risk, and then climate change is a part of that landscape, as opposed to sort of the front and center part. I don't know if that comes up sometimes and how you think about it.
Potentially. I mean, it's definitely deeply baked into the IPCC, for example. The idea is that risk is emergent from exposure and sensitivity and vulnerability, basically. So you need to be somewhere. If we're talking about sea level rise, you need to be near a coast to be vulnerable to sea level rise. If you have expensive built infrastructure and the vehicle to get you out of the way quickly, if there's a storm surge, for example, you have less risk than someone who doesn't have access to those things. So certainly there's those calculations play into a part of it. And I think I have them on the wheel at some point, but these were, I guess, taken from mostly natural science teaching of climate change. And that's why we actually added this sixth wedge to the wheel that wasn't present in the IPCC, which was it's climate. Because I mean, the IPCC's job is to talk about the latest science. And so, for the IPCC to say, hey, there's a thing called climate and there are greenhouse gases that trap heat. Right. I mean, that's not their remit, but high school students need to learn that. So, and we found that there was a lot of focus on these just very basic physics that, I mean, are 200 years old knowledge kind of thing, but that is foundational. So that was what we found.
That's great. Well, anytime you can break it into the components, then at least, it's like with nuclear power. When I talk about nuclear power, all my good friends in the environmental movement fragment immediately into camps and they start fighting with each other. So I start to say, well, let's split it into pieces. Let's talk about what do you do with existing nuclear power plants? And should we have nuclear as a future in the future? And at least then it starts to become actionable pathways as opposed to no nukes, some yes nukes. And so the idea of splitting it into its pieces, I think, and your book has that landscape laid out pretty well, is a good starting place, I think, to find traction and get action. I want to dive back into Michele's book, which has, here, let me just show this again. It resonates with, way back in 2009, I was so excited when I saw in Nature, in the news section of Nature, there was this article, do we need to go to risk school as a society, a global society? And the answer to me, of course, is yes. The earlier in our experience we can start to understand the mechanics of risk, the better off I think we would be. See, at least in theory, of course. And then you do talk about how we all have this different. Here, your book, I put in this: know thyself seems to be the first step, Michele, in your methodology. In other words, what's your particular reaction to risk, or is that right?
Yeah, it's interesting how different people are, and how once you start looking at why you are reacting to risks the way you are and why the people around you are reacting to them, it opens up whole new conversations and pathways to resolve some differences. We all have this risk fingerprint, which is a combination of our innate personality, which you can't really change. But you respond in a certain way to experiences because of that. And like a fingerprint, if you cut your finger, there's an indelible mark. And the way you respond to that depends in part on who you were in the first place, but it also depends on your habits and on your environment. Just like a regular fingerprint might, have calluses if you do manual labor, or be super soft if you use lotion and take care of it. Or interestingly, temperature changes your risk perception and your willingness to take risks. So all sorts of weird, surprising things like the fragrance in the air or what you had for lunch. But once you are mindful of this, you can see that, well, hey, maybe I need someone to pull me back from the ledge because I'm just much more of a leap before you look kind of a person. And then other people who are way too cautious, who don't see the potential positive side of risks, could stand a group of people around them to help to support them, to help to make them feel more comfortable. And I think that this all goes, just looking at climate change, there's some people who just naturally get it and they're worried about it. But one of the other parts of this relationship with risk has to do with the risk itself and how much control you feel you have over it, how much choice you feel you have in being subjected to this risk. Yeah. And climate change is the kind of thing where a lot of people feel like it's so big. What difference could I possibly make? And there's this conversation in the climate change media world that drives me absolutely bonkers, which is when people say, okay, what can I do? And then there are all these, really, snarky, smarter than thou, usually, younger journalists who are like, oh, well, you're a sucker if you stop eating meat. You're a sucker if you take public transportation instead of driving your SUV or even having the SUV in the first place. Because, when you do that, it takes the responsibility off of the corporations and the governments. And I see that as completely counterproductive. First of all, because there's this implication that, you don't have to do anything. You don't have a role because the corporations, governments are responsible. And not that they shouldn't be doing a lot more, and they should, but also, many times corporations see what people want. They respond to consumer demand for things, and that makes it possible to have more sustainable products, and makes it harder for companies to do something that's very dirty and emissions intensive because people will respond to that. But it really speaks to this sense of agency and the fact that to make change you need billions of people to do somewhat, often small, sometimes bigger changes. There's a report that Rare did based on Project Drawdown recommendations and saying that depending on how far people go, by making behavioral changes, whether it's, public transport or your car or, installing insulation or things, all of these things, we can actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions by somewhere between 19% and 37%. And that's not nothing. And so when I hear these people, saying, oh, don't stop eating meat because it doesn't make a difference, it makes me bonkers, because also when people believe that they don't have the ability to change something, they're just going to say la, 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 and tune it out. So this idea of voluntariness and control and human agency is so important. So, the next time I see one of those articles saying, you're a sucker for doing these things and it's somebody else's responsibility, my head's going to explode.
So, Kim, I know you've been in that arena for sure. And the other aspect of this that comes up is doomism. It's sort of another dimension of the communication crisis, maybe around the climate crisis. You have these. So what do you feel when does your head explode, or what makes your head explode, or then what makes you excited? What's the inverse? What's an example of the inverse where you suddenly get engaged and excited about where we go from here?
Sure. Well, yeah, I just came from right before this conversation. I was having a conversation with colleagues who we're working actually on a paper addressing exactly this issue and why we actually do need both system and behavior change to solve the climate crisis. And beyond the important connections between the roles individuals play in scaling up behavior through creating norms and culture change, and the way we influence the political and economic systems, which are absolutely essential, there's just some math that we can't get around, which is the 10% of us who are in the highest income and therefore highest emitting category are responsible for half of household climate emissions. And, you know, that people say, oh, but it's these 100 companies who have caused over 70% of emissions. That's absolutely true. We have abundant evidence from journalism and from research colleagues of the misinformation that has been propagated by fossil fuel companies. And it's infuriating and it's wrong. And I mean, there should be consequences. But that doesn't let us off the hook, because what we have to do to stabilize the climate is get to zero carbon pollution. And that means we have to stop the production and consumption of fossil fuels. So those of us who are at this high end of income, and it's actually not as high as most people think, it starts at $38,000 a year. That group and above is the responsible group that does need to look at behavior change. And that was where in 2017, Seth Wines and I did a study showing that the most effective high impact personal climate actions that quickly reduce our own emissions are to go car, flight, and meat free. So those are the areas to focus on reductions, where across systems, we had 39 studies and carbon calculators. I think it was 164 scenarios. Consistently, those three areas do make a substantial difference. And those are kind of the personal versions of some of the system changes that we need in order to reduce the need for long distance mobility, to have more localized lives where we can have active transport that meets all of our needs in our neighborhoods, for example, and to have more plant-based and regenerative agriculture. That's what it looks like on the individual level. And that helps, as Michele was saying, create space for policies and practices that push on the system level as well.
Yeah, I think I resonate with all of this. This is the ultimate and plus problem. And anytime I see people say, yes, it has to be this or it has to be that, I then start to subdivide things and say, well, what about this? And I even got Mark Jacobson, who's stridently anti-nuclear and has insisted, despite counter evidence, that we can be all renewable by 2030 or 2040, 2050. A conversation one day, on a video conversation, he acknowledged, well, yeah, no, some nuclear power plants that are operating and have a good track record, I wouldn't be opposed to them keeping going. So again, they're even with someone like that who's so dug in, so my way or the highway, there seem to be paths forward. I do, and the thing that Kim, that you just said that I think is really important is identifying these subsets, like the White House summit that's going to take place 23rd Earth Day and the day after. Virtually the 40 countries there are responsible for 95% of the emissions. So that, you don't necessarily need 196 countries in the room to get substantial traction. And Obama and George Bush before worked on the same model, major economies, major emitters, finding those subgroups, the wealthiest countries with the highest footprints, the industries with the highest historic emissions, you can make some progress. So I think you're both onto something. And Michele, in your book, I'm going to show a slide here again. Whoops, wrong. That's important too. I was at that meeting at National Geographic when they had a meeting on climate change needs behavior change. But the one I wanted to show is different. It's right here. Hold on a second. Yeah. You have a section in the book on, well, you start with getting comfortable with your own personal risk perception and risk understanding. But then you talk in a graded way toward the community and diversity. There's a diversity of attitudes. And that leads me and you apparently to the idea of tolerance for difference. If I'm getting that section of your book right, that you have to understand that any landscape of solutions will require a diversity of perceptions, both of risk and of solutions. And so how does this resonate there too? Response diversity is what some scientists call it in ecosystem studies.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Perspective is so important. I get asked a lot, is this a gray rhino? Is that a gray rhino? And I have to say, well, it depends on your perspective, because the threat looks very different depending on where you are coming from. Is it a threat that you're not going to be able to sell your oil anymore? Or is it a threat that your asthma is going to get worse? Or is it a threat that your house is going to be flooded? It's a different threat to different people. And I found that around the world, people's attitudes are very different. Like, not surprisingly, developing countries are more sensitive to climate risk. But I started diving into this more on the financial risk side of things because when the gray rhino came out in China, it was a very, very, very big deal. And people were very sensitive to financial risk. And I would get asked all sorts of questions about reducing financial risk and about asset bubbles and things like that. And, I'd come back to the States and, they're like, let's just keep pumping up the bubble. No problem. And it was such a divergence. It was a little bit head spinning. And I'm so glad you put up the risk perception gap chart that Lloyd's Register Foundation has pulled together. And this basically shows that there are some countries that have a lot more experience with something, and so they're probably going to be more sensitive to it, but that's not always true. I also cite in You Are What You Risk some research that the Risk and Policy Working Group did around COVID, or different states in the US, red states and blue states. And across the board, it found that people overestimated both the likelihood of getting COVID and of dying from it if you got it. But there wasn't a correlation between how risky you thought it was and whether you took risk mitigation steps, like whether you wore a mask or social distancing or stayed home and things like that. The biggest difference they found was the messaging from public health officials and other elected officials. It was, are there things that you can do easily every day, and do those things work? And that goes full circle to climate change. There's a sort of behavioral change that people need. Is there something that I can do? If there's something that I can do, then I'll pay more attention to this risk. But if there's something I can't do anything about, well, I'm just going to, see no, hear no, speak no evil. And, it's like I get asked a lot about the asteroid, the possibility of an asteroid hitting the Earth. There was a big article in the New Yorker about that as I was writing The Gray Rhino. And, they're all like, yes, this is going to happen. When? Is it, 10 years, 30 years, 1,000 years? That part we can't predict. And there's not a whole heck of a lot realistically that we can do about it. So that I've kind of shoved to the side, and hopefully that's a good, risk calculation. But a lot of people don't understand how to make those calculations. And so this risk school idea, I think, is actually quite a good one. We need to understand how to evaluate risks. And the people who just look at the numbers need to start factoring in that there's an emotional part to this. And the people who are just emotional need to start looking at the numbers, and the two sides need to start having a conversation that can help to move us all forward.
I'm sure, Kim, this resonates with you. You live in Europe, you're American born. And I see over and over again. Actually, quick question. Can either of you go beyond the hour, or are you have a hard stop?
I have a little flexibility, yeah.
Okay, great, because we're getting there. But this is really productive, I think, and interesting. So anyway, Kim, you live in Europe. You grew up in America. You have experienced, I'm sure, different senses of the climate problem and where we go with it. Sweden has a lot of nuclear power, for example, and right nearby there are countries that Germany has all turned it all off. So how does that idea resonate with you too? Getting comfortable with that diversity.
I think the perspective, I have gained a lot of valuable perspective from living in Sweden, and both from learning and becoming part of culture and politics and what's happening here. I'd say the science is not terribly different, the science fundamentally agrees wherever you are in the world, so that isn't a big difference. But the way that science is taken into account and into policy is dramatically different, especially over the last 4 years. Has been a very dramatic contrast between the US and Sweden. I think maybe something I can reflect on is also being an American living outside of the US since 2010, and sort of realizing how critical a role the US plays in global climate negotiations, having been in the room where the Paris Agreement was adopted and present at some of the UN negotiations, and just seeing how central the US is, and how tragic the history of the US delaying and slowing down and preventing agreement and preventing meaningful climate action really is. So that's why part of my motivation in writing, in particular to an American audience, is to hopefully give people more agency and more urgency in seeing the role that America can and must play in actually working towards climate stability, because of the opportunities we have to do it, the potentials we have, the very high emissions we have, both historically and still currently, that need to be reduced. And I think American leadership, both from the grassroots bottom up and from the top down, can play a really important role.
I wanted to show this one other thing here that, well, here is a piece you wrote. Well, here are two pieces that you both wrote recently as we get toward the end here. One is on releasing ideas into the world, which you both have done and are doing. And that takes a certain amount of risk, embracing risk, putting yourself out there. And Kim, again, you in terms of grappling and encouraging scientists particularly to grapple honestly and convey their emotional side. Several things we've talked about here are like how you balance either within a community discussion or amongst colleagues or in your own mind, the data part and the values part. If you could crystallize your two books' core messages in hopes that key, well, I guess we could ask who is the person who needs to read them, and what's the key point you're hoping that people will resonate with? Maybe Kim first, and then Michele.
I love this task of like, work on this book for 4 years, slave over it, fact check it, everything, and then can you just reduce it to a tweet? Thanks. Like,
yeah, what am I going to say?
No, that's fine. There is a TLDR, too long didn't read, in the back of the book. So, I mean, you can start there if you want to read just the bullet points. Oh, you actually start at the beginning, Andy. Okay. But, yeah. So I guess my summary is, ordinary people have so much more power and importance than we realize. And we need to harness and use that if we're actually going to solve the climate crisis, which is on us to do, because we are the last people who can stabilize the climate at a reasonable temperature compatible with a good life on Earth. So we happen to be alive at this incredibly critical moment where we are the most important people who have ever lived, because our actions are going to have such profound and overwhelming ramifications in our own lifetimes, not only for future generations, but also for them. So I want people to feel like what we do matters, because it does, and everybody has a role to play. And I hope that in Under the Sky We Make, I illustrate some ways that people can play meaningful roles. And it's not just about science, although that is an important piece of it. But, I start off by saying science won't save us. Science has pretty much carried our knowledge as far as we can go in the time that we have. But thankfully, it's enough. We have the solutions we need, and we need people to now put those into practice and get democratic and political will behind it and start implementing them, and getting people excited about harnessing our creativity to solve this biggest problem. So that was a really long tweet. I'll have to work on the...
No. I'm all about not, I'm on Twitter all the time, but I think what I like Twitter for is when it leads to a deeper examination, deeper conversations. The conversation can never happen on Twitter. These efforts to have discourse there back and forth thing really end up too crystallized and simplistic. So I'm saying everyone should read your book. and
well, I'm not going to contradict you there, Andy. No. Thank you.
and take the time to do so, because you cut across some of these simple definitions of problems and solutions. Sustainability. The reason my this webcast is called Sustain What is I'm not telling you what to do. It's interrogatory. How hot? How many species? How much justice? The word sustainability itself is useless without starting to, as I said earlier, divide it into its pieces and getting clear on where we're going. So Michele, in the context of risk literacy that can actually end the blah, blah, blah bang pattern, or at least erode it that I talk about, what's your key rallying cry for folks?
Yeah, well, in both The Gray Rhino and You Are What You Risk, the message is really that you need to not just understand the risk in front of you, but your response to it and why. The Gray Rhino much more from a structural and organizational point of view, and You Are What You Risk from a more personal and cultural and psychological point of view, that it's not enough to say, okay, I identified the risk. Like, that's not risk management or risk literacy. It's understanding why you're responding the way that you do, as an organization, as an individual, as a society. And once you start looking at why you're responding the way you do, you come to understand so many things about yourself and about the people around you. It provides a very, very powerful lens into your life, the decisions that you make, the risks that you take. And it also provides other people a very powerful lens into you, so that your risk decisions really matter in how other people are going to see you.
That sounds so, yeah, you've said so much there that's really resonates with me. Of course, I'm again biased. I have my own biases here, and I'm screwing up the visuals again. Let's try to get this correct. I would, there's many things about Elon Musk that drive me crazy. But the one thing about Elon Musk that I embrace, and I wrote about on .earth back in the last year of that blog, was his ability to convey public learning and comfort with failure. That was when one of the rockets didn't land correctly, and he was immediately tweeting his assessment of what went wrong and what they could learn from it to do it better, as opposed to hiding away and being silent about it. He was putting the failure in the foreground. And if there's anything that demonstrates why I can't remember if he's still the wealthiest man in the world or not, it's that he's fearless about failure. And I think not everybody's like him or should be like him. We need all kinds of people. We need precautionary people and people who are willing to fail. But I do think, and I want to close with some kids, because it feels like it's very relevant to where we are here after this hour with two people offering personal solution paths amid complexity and inevitability, which is a big chunk of the climate problem. The world's heating. There's a lot of it about that you can't stop quickly, and there's a lot you can do. It's been great to have you here, but I want to show this video clip. I referred to it here. Give me 1 second, because I'm my own producer. This is
You're an incredible one-man show, Andy. We've got to give you credit. You do a great job.
Yeah, my wife was a science teacher for a long time before she teaches teachers how to teach sustainability. But before she was doing that, she was in the classroom, and she had a very innovative. She had a very innovative co-teacher. Let me make sure I got the right clip here. And they did a lot of kids do this. So what you're seeing is that, again, a lot of kids do these breaking bridges exercises with balsa wood, and they're in teams, and they have to build the bridge, and they have the same amount of stuff, and they have to do it in different ways, and they have different designs. But what Michael Topchick, her co-teacher, came up with was a cost benefit part of it. So you had to pay for the wood with fake money, and you had to do an assessment afterwards, sort of like Elon Musk. What broke? Why did it fail? How did it fail? And they were assessed based on a broader sense of just not the bridge breaking, but on the cost benefit, which is so much like the real world. The risks we face are all a function of trade-offs. So just watch this, and the best part of it is the enthusiasm. Hold on. Isn't that what learning ought to look like? So I think that's what learning ought to look like. And I think that's a big chunk, again, of what you're talking about in your books. You're creating an environment, a learning landscape at different scales. So thanks so much to Kimberly Nicholas from London University, author of the new book, Under the Sky We Make, How to Be Human in a Warming World. Yes, hold it a little closer. Hold it closer to the camera. There we go. And Michele Wucker, author of the huge bestseller Gray Rhino, and now your new book, You Are What You Risk, The New Art and Science of Navigating an Uncertain World. So everybody out there, I hope you navigate well this week. There's still risk and opportunity all around us. This is the Sustain What webcast from the Earth Institute. Now the Columbia Climate School, as of today, Monday, the Earth Institute is going through a big change because the climate problem is so big. And go forward, share this when we're done. Look at that scrolling, distracting bar at the bottom for information on how to get in touch with me with ideas for future episodes or feedback on this one. And hug the people in your bubble and connect with the people outside your bubble. If they have different risk beliefs, then all the more reason to converse with them. Thanks again, and have a good evening, Kimberly, and a good day, Michelle.
Thanks, Andy. This has been really fun. Great to meet you, Kimberly.
Maybe come back
Likewise.
sometime. I'd love to have you back sometime. We could get into more depth on some aspects of this.